Eugeniusz Romer, witam Państwa. Jesteśmy na konferencji Three Seas One Opportunity w Gdańsku. A dzisiaj rozmawiamy z panem Robertem Personem, który jest wykładowcą studiów stosunków międzynarodowych na Akademii Wojskowej Stanów Zjednoczonych, czyli West Point. I tutaj prosił też o zaznaczenie, że to, co będzie mówił podczas tego wywiadu, to są jego osobiste opinie, a nie oficjalne stanowisko West Point. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
As far as I know, your field of expertise is Russia and Russian outer policy. So now, at the beginning, I would like to ask you about the perception in the USA of Russia and of Russia's action in Ukraine among the most important political powers. I mean, Democrats and the Republicans.
So, I think in the United States, ever since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of February 2022, there's been sort of a united sense among Americans and our elected leaders in both parties that, Russia has engaged in illegal and unjust invasion and violation of a sovereign country. And so, that has generally translated into, very strong support for Ukraine and a willingness to support Ukraine in a variety of ways, providing weapons, providing economic aid, coordination, intelligence, and whatnot, to ultimately help Ukraine win the war. Of course, all countries have our domestic political divisions, and certainly viewers are probably aware that though Ukraine enjoys widespread bipartisan support in the United States and in both houses of our Congress, there is a minority that tend to be mostly sort of on the right wing of the Republican Party that have expressed a skepticism towards further support for Ukraine, and their motivations are somewhat difficult to describe without going too deep into American domestic politics. But because of some of the influence they hold in the Congress, they were able to essentially hold hostage the most recent aid package for Ukraine for about 6 months.
But it is because I try to combine the internal politics with the outer politics or international politics regarding Ukraine, right?
Correct. And of course that's partly a matter of political tactics. It also reflects, something that I see as a worrying trend in American politics. Once upon a time, issues of foreign policy, there was much greater consensus and a recognition that our own domestic politics sort of and our adversaries between Republicans and Democrats, those should stop at the water's edge. Now increasingly, our political parties seem to want to make foreign policy a partisan issue. And again, 6 months of delays to Ukrainian aid show just how costly that is.
But just to make it clear, so I assume this is, let's say, not as the European media stated, so the Republicans are against Ukraine or against helping Ukraine and the Democrats are pro-Ukraine. This is too simple and this is basically not true.
Absolutely. It's not true because, again, if you look at the most recent vote totals, very large numbers of Republicans voted in both the House and the Senate in support of Ukrainian aid. Now, of course, the wild card in American politics, as we all know, is Donald Trump, who holds considerable influence in the Republican Party, and to a large degree, the positions that he takes can be very influential on the rest of the Republican Party. And so, in the case of the recent aid package, he didn't vocally support it, but he also didn't oppose it, and that gave Republicans sort of enough.
So that's a kind of mystery, right? We don't really know what he thinks about Ukraine.
I think we don't really know what he thinks about a lot of things.
He likes to surprise.
He likes to surprise. I personally, favor predictability, and so it's difficult to know Certainly we don't know who will win the November presidential election. If it is President Trump who is elected, it's hard to say what his approach to Ukraine will be. But I certainly hope that regardless of who wins, America will continue to stand by our Ukrainian allies.
So do you think that this is in American interest to protect Ukraine, to support Ukraine still?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. It's in America's interest, it's in the interest of the West, and the broader free world, because what's happening in Ukraine, Ukrainians aren't just fighting for their own freedom, they're fighting for all countries who want to choose for themselves who their friends are, who their allies are, who their trade partners are. Russia's vision is a world where great powers decide that for smaller countries. And though America is a large and powerful country, a world in which autocrats like Putin get to dictate to others, how they should behave, that's not a good world for us.
So this is the matter of values?
It's a matter of values and interests, and I don't think that it's easy to separate the two. And certainly in this case, both point in the same direction. Sort of our values certainly point towards freedom and liberty and the right of all nations to choose their destinies. But again, it's in our most basic national security interests that Ukraine win this war, because again, if Putin is allowed to win in Ukraine, then it certainly sends a signal to him about what else he can do in other places, and it sends a signal to other countries that might seek to revise international borders to reclaim territories.
So it just means a less stable world in general.
Yes.
Yeah, so coming to Russia, so why is Russia so determined to conquer Ukraine? Because its military performed really badly, especially at the beginning of this war, and now Russia is paying a really high cost of this war, I mean economically but also demographically, so it will completely, someone else say, diminish the role of Russia in the future. So why is still continuing this war and so determined to win?
So, I think that Russia has essentially been pursuing the same fundamental strategic objectives, certainly for as long as Putin has been in power. And one of those objectives is to establish a privileged and uncontested sphere of influence across the entire post-Soviet region. Now, one certainly could argue that that sort of imperial impulse extends much, much farther back than just Putin's reign. But even if we limit our analysis to the last 25 years, it's clear that he has tried over and over again to essentially seize the sovereignty of countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, and others, and to be able to dictate what they can and can't do. And so that's such a deeply ingrained fundamental objective that I think this motivates so much of what Russia does, and is so. I think Putin is so attached to achieving that that he'll continue trying to achieve that world, to achieve that vision for as long as he lives.
So, but is it really beneficial to Russia? So, or maybe to Russian people, does it help them in any way that they will have this buffer zone or zone that they control? So, or is it somehow beneficial to Putin? How does it change the position of Russia? Why is it so important to them?
That's a deep question. Yeah. That's a very deep question.
Because for some may say that it doesn't really make any sense. Why conquering other countries? Mm-hmm. What's the point?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think, objectively that it's beneficial to the Russian people or Russia as an entity. Again, it's incredibly costly, and they're destroying, they're destroying wealth, they're destroying lives, and war is always a costly and destructive endeavor. Now, of course, I don't think Putin has much regard at all for what's good for the Russian people, and fundamentally he's motivated by what best enhances his political power. And so, you know, as he now looks into his third decade in power and continues to have to find new ways to legitimize his rule and his authoritarian regime, you know, I think this war has become essentially the justification for his continued rule. And so, in that respect, again, I think he now depends on the war for his own political survival and is just further and further entrenched. But again, in the meantime, sort of the cost and the tragedy is staggering.
Sorry for asking you to speak for Mr. Putin, but and explaining him, but just I think it's interesting, like what are here his real purposes. But from what you're saying, one may also conclude that this situation could have been predicted, that Putin will attack Ukraine. But I think many people, I don't know how about the elites in Washington or in the USA in general, but in Europe, they believed this is not true. This is insane. This is just his rhetorics, that he's trying to impress his people and this kind of activities. But in general, he didn't want to start a war, and Europeans were trading with Russia and somehow aligning with Russia. So, do you think this could have been predicted?
So, you know, we have this saying that hindsight is 20/20. It's always easier to sort of see all of the mistakes and all of the missed opportunities, you know, when you look back in history. I've long argued that, you know, Russia's war against Ukraine didn't start in 2022. It didn't start in 2014, as many people claim. I think the starting point is 2004 and 2005, around the time of the Orange Revolution. So here's a moment when you know, Ukraine is undergoing or attempting to undergo the peaceful democratic transition of power through elections, and Russia intervenes directly, manipulates those elections to achieve the outcome that would install a leader most beneficial to Moscow. And, you know, Putin is thwarted by the Ukrainian people when they rise up in protest in the Orange Revolution and demand that their choice, their democratic choice, be respected. And so, you know, he sort of continues to sort of manipulate sort of with political tools and weapons. Again, in 2014, the Ukrainian people stand up and resist Putin's attempts to ultimately seize control of Ukrainian democracy. And he fails then. And so in 2022, we have this extreme escalation because he's run out of, you know, all of his other hybrid tools have failed, and so, you know, he's left with this last resort. So in that respect, the pattern is clear. He's been trying to subjugate Ukraine for over 20 years, and yes, we should have recognized it.
So probably his purpose was because the Orange Revolution could have shaken like the fundamentals of his rule in Russia, because he claims that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. So if the same nation, but living in another country, chooses to be democratic and pro-Western and is successful in it, then some people in Russia may have thought, we also want to be democratic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And he gets a taste of that in 2011 and 2012 when he switches again the tandem with Dmitry Medvedev, and, you know, some significant protests erupt in Russian cities as he is coming back into power. And I think that moment really does kind of radicalize him to this fear. If you know, you could have colored revolutions in Ukraine, in Georgia, and elsewhere, then it could happen in Russia, and there are uprisings in Russia. And so I think all of this sort of contributes to sort of an increasing paranoia in his head. Now, to the question of, you know, should we have seen it coming, I think because he had never taken such an extraordinary step as, the full-scale invasion of a country as large as Ukraine. I think many simply believed that nobody could be that crazy. But I think what a lot of us failed to appreciate is just how obsessed he had been for so long about solving the Ukrainian problem. And that's where I think we got it wrong. We just failed to appreciate how much importance he attached to that issue in particular.
So I think now many people may think that this is it would be crazy if he used nuclear weapons. So no one is that crazy to start nuclear war. But actually, when Putin is so desperate, so paranoid, as you said, and so willing to conquer Ukraine, but he's apparently, maybe not now, but in previous months, we saw him losing. So do you think, in any case, he's going to do that, actually, to use nuclear weapons?
So, I still believe that nuclear weapon use is unlikely. And I think that is because, while Putin certainly makes miscalculations and mistakes, I don't think he's fundamentally irrational. And I think he understands that using nuclear weapons would be fundamentally destabilizing to his own political power and a complete game changer. And so, I don't think that he's likely to do that, not least of which because, as I understand, and, I don't have any access to confirm this, access to intelligence to confirm this directly, but my understanding is that Xi Jinping has made it very clear that, China would not accept Russian nuclear weapons use. And of course, we now know that Russia is very much dependent on China to sort of continue the war, and so I think that restraint is probably playing an important role on deterring Putin, as is the fear of whatever consequences would come from a Western reaction should he use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So I continue to put my faith in deterrence, and I hope that I won't be proven wrong.
But there is a rift between European countries and European Ukraine allies and the United States of America, because the European states said, for example, the British, that Ukraine can use arms which are delivered from the UK to actually hit the targets which are located in Russia. And I think the US is consequently stopping Ukraine from doing so, or not delivering arms which are capable of hitting targets in Russia. So is it because of the fear that Russia may respond in using nuclear weapons?
So, of course, this is one of those areas where things continue to change and evolve. And just in the last week, of course, President Biden, has changed his position and, has now agreed to allow Ukraine to at least strike Russian targets over the border in the vicinity of Kharkiv. I will say, and here I'll emphasize again, these are my personal views, certainly not speaking officially for the United States government, but I personally believe that we shouldn't be putting those restrictions on Ukraine. I think they have every right to defend themselves, and they have every existential need to be able to defend themselves. The Ukrainians aren't going to use American weapons to bomb Russian civilians and cities the way that Russia does. They are going to use them against legitimate military targets that are contributing to the war effort. And so what you raise, I think, is an example of how the Biden administration has, throughout the course of the war, I think, been overly cautious of fear of Russian escalation. But when in fact, I think what the pattern shows is that Russia escalates when they're most confident, when they are when they are winning and succeeding. That's when they choose to go farther, not when they are sort of met with strong resistance.
So if you don't escalate or are hesitant to escalate or to fight back, Russia takes this as a weakness, right?
Yes, yeah, and they go further.
So we don't know how is the war going to end? Because at the beginning, maybe Ukraine was performing very well, but now due to lack of arms, but also lack of people willing and able to fight, Ukraine is in defense, let's put it that way. So do you think that Russia, in other terms, is going to go further and attack NATO countries, or Baltic countries, or Poland maybe?
I don't. Again, I still believe firmly in the deterrent power and in the strength of the NATO Article 5 commitment. And I think a Russian conventional attack of sort of the traditional classical sense against a NATO ally would trigger a massive unified NATO response. However, I think the Russians know that as well, and I think they understand that they can be very effective at operating at that sort of sub-threshold level. And again, we can use, there's a whole sort of vocabulary, whether you want to call it gray zone or hybrid warfare, multi-domain operations. And I think that remains really the sort of the real threat that we have to defend against is the whole range of sort of divisive and corrosive tactics that they can and will and do use against NATO countries that are less obvious than tanks rolling across the border. And that's we've struggled with that problem since 2014. And while a lot of the focus has been on the conventional aspect of the Ukrainian war, we can't ignore that problem either.
So don't you think that this is the highest time to establish really clear, precise red lines and ways to respond in such a hybrid threats that you're mentioning that Russia may use? And we have the upcoming summit of NATO in Washington soon, in a month. So what's your opinion on that? Maybe this is the good place and time to actually establish really clear red lines.
So red lines are always tricky because on some level you're trying to sort of set absolute conditions that will trigger a specific response. But we know that the world is infinitely complex and nuanced, and so either you set so many red lines to try to imagine sort of every possible scenario, but then they sometimes have a tendency of either boxing in leaders or showing your adversary just how far they can go without sort of getting in trouble. And so that's why I think for a lot of these issues, strategic ambiguity tends to be the preferred approach, partly because it gives policymakers some flexibility, but partly because it gives us the ability to sort of respond in a time and a place and a way of our choosing. And so I think that as long as those responses, be they overt or covert or public or in the shadows, as long as those responses are being developed, then I think we apply them sort of when and where we choose.
And my final question is about the next NATO Secretary General. Do you think it should be someone from the eastern flank of NATO?
And it's an interesting question. Maybe somewhat outside my area of expertise. So maybe I'll just sort of limit my answer to noting that I think the eastern flank of NATO understands the Russian threat more clearly and more completely than anywhere else, because they've lived in the shadow of the Russian bear for their entire histories, and so they certainly know what the challenge is, and conceivably could be in a good place to understand that. But then, of course, the political challenge of any leader is then to bridge to those countries that perhaps view the situation differently or don't feel the threat from Russia as urgently as they do on the front lines.
So is there any chance that someone from the eastern flank is going to be the next secretary, or do you expect someone else to take this position?
You know, I'll note that political scientists are notoriously bad at predicting the future, and so I'll decline to make a prediction. But you know, certainly like your viewers, I'm waiting with very anxiously to see what the decision is.
Thank you very much, sir. It was really interesting listening to your answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Dziękuję także, że Państwo byli z nami. Przypomnę, że naszym gościem był Robert Person z West Point i przypomnę także, że poglądy tutaj wygłoszone były jego osobistymi poglądami, a nie oficjalnym stanowiskiem tej uczelni. Dziękuję Państwu i do zobaczenia.